This is Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. The MENA Talks is a series by the BIC on the wider Middle East and Africa regions. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will have a frank discussion on underlying historical, economic, social, and political drivers behind today's systemic issues. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Welcome to this episode of the MENA Talks podcast. My name is Ben Lowings. I am a political analyst at the Brussels International Centre. And today I am pleased to be joined by Alessandro Mattiato, who is a coordinator for EU-NATO Relations at the Secretariat General of the European Commission. As of the recording of this episode, Europe in 2023 continues to be in a precarious state. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine continues, and hostile and threatening rhetoric also continues from Moscow to Europe. Defence has become a major priority in this climate, and with the accession requests of Finland and Sweden, it seems that EU member states are turning more and more to NATO as a guarantor of their security. Similarly, on the 10th of January of this year, NATO and the EU signed their third joint declaration on EU-NATO cooperation. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that with the accession of Finland and Sweden, NATO will be protecting 96% of the citizens in the European Union. So we can start from here. Alessandro, as a formative question, can you give a brief explanation of how the EU and NATO partnership on defence is structured?
Thank you very much, Ben, also for the kind introduction. Very happy to be here and to be speaking to you about EU-NATO cooperation. Starting indeed from your first question, and you, I think, set the scene very well, recalling the situation, the geopolitical context in which we find ourselves right now, and also the latest major developments when it comes to the cooperation. So the signature of the joint declaration by the three institutional leaders, indeed Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, on the Commission side, our President Ursula von der Leyen, and the European Council President Charles Michel. Maybe starting a little bit with a few elements of history in terms of the EU-NATO partnership, which is absolutely key for the European Union. It dates back to 2003 with the signature of the Berlin Plus administrative arrangement that for the first time allowed the European Union to resort to the use of NATO assets and capabilities for crisis management operations. Fast forward to the true game changer in the cooperation, 2016, with the signature of the first joint declaration, again by the three institutional leaders. At the time, obviously, Commission President Juncker, Secretary General Stoltenberg, and European Council President Donald Tusk. That was really the key moment, a political statement in which the three leaders stressed the joint commitment to increase cooperation in a broad number of areas, a partnership based on shared values, but also on some key principles that are really the guiding principles when it comes to EU-NATO cooperation and interactions between the staffs. Openness, transparency, inclusiveness, reciprocity, and obviously the respect of the decision-making authority of both organizations. The first declaration was followed up by a second one in Brussels in 2018, and both were then followed by the so-called 74 common proposals, which are basically 74 concrete actions that guide cooperation between the respective staffs. EU staff, and that obviously includes the Commission, but also the European External Action Service, most importantly, and the European Defence Agency on the EU side. And on NATO side, obviously, NATO international staff. Why do I mention this? Because it's extremely important to stress that indeed the 74 common proposals, so the current framework for our cooperation, concerns mostly interaction between the staffs. We have identified 7 areas that range from countering hybrid threats, including disinformation, to operational coordination, including at sea, maritime cooperation, cybersecurity, cyber defense, defense capabilities, defense industry, exercises, but also, quite importantly, obviously, capacity building of partners. On top of that, there is also a layer that concerns political dialogue, so increasing political dialogue at all levels between the two institutions. Now, how does this work in practice? In order to have a very good overview and coordinated approach, obviously, because as you might know, we have quite a lot of actors involved. I mentioned indeed the three institutions in a way, but obviously speaking from a Commission perspective, which is my focus, it's important to keep in mind that we have more than 15 Commission Directorate Generals that are involved in daily cooperation, basically, with their counterparts in NATO. So the whole cooperation is structured around a cooperation mechanism at staff level, the so-called EU-NATO core group that basically represents the European External Action Service, the Commission, and the European Defence Agency, and NATO, and it is at staff level. So I am the Commission representative in that setting, and it sets the scene and steers coordination at staff level, identifying some of the priorities, the areas in which we can do more as well. And at higher level, we have the so-called EU-NATO steering group. On the Commission side is our Deputy Secretary General that represents the Commission, and it offers, obviously, political validation. This is the framework at staff level. I'm very happy then to elaborate. I think we'll have the chance on some of the concrete elements of our cooperation. You mentioned the third joint declaration, and that I think it's a good way to conclude a little bit also the historical overview of our cooperation. That is indeed the latest, was signed earlier this year, as you recalled. Very important statement in terms not only of reinforcing our existing cooperation, but also in recognizing the fact that it has been a success story. The level of cooperation that we have achieved is really unprecedented across all areas that I mentioned. But there is clearly the chance and the opportunity to do more, and this is really the moment to do so. You have mentioned indeed the geopolitical context. This is also very prominent in the third joint declaration. The leaders have also reaffirmed the commitment of the EU and NATO to support Ukraine in the face of the Russian aggression, and the importance of doing this together jointly. I will just mention one very powerful element. On the 24th of February, we are reaching now the sad anniversary of the Russian aggression. The very first day of the Russian aggression, the three leaders stood together at NATO headquarters, giving a joint press conference, strongly condemning the Russian aggression. And this is a symbol that really epitomizes, in a way, the strength of EU-NATO cooperation in this very moment.
Okay, thanks for that. I think that's a really useful scene-setting response to this question of how the EU and NATO interact and work together. I'm going to follow up on one of your points that you mentioned, which is this idea of increasing political dialogue between the actors as a key political goal, I guess, of the cooperation. And one of the questions I have is, how does this happen in practice? For example, the NATO alliance has existed for several years now and has been a guiding principle of cooperation between transatlantic allies beyond the European Union since the Second World War. And my question is, with the EU developing its capacities in these recent years, especially pivoting more towards defense as its own separate goal, how does this interaction between this more long-standing military alliance and this political union work in practice, especially with these dialogues and these steering groups?
It's an extremely relevant point, and I think we can start by reflecting a little bit indeed on the geopolitical context. I think the Russian aggression against Ukraine has shown not only the importance of strong military capabilities and the importance of having extremely resilient societies, and this is something that Ukraine is showing every day, their strength and their resilience, also when it comes to critical infrastructure, to their energy network that are constantly attacked by Russia. And I think this leads to a broader reflection on what defense should really be. I think it's very clear that we're not talking about only hardcore military capabilities, as I think the discussion was framed years back, but we're really thinking about a 360 degrees approach that includes specifically resilience. And I think this is one of the main elements on which we should focus today. And this is extremely important because it's a reflection, obviously, that NATO is doing. Resilience has increased incredibly the relevance for the alliance as the first line of deterrence and defense. Obviously, you need resilient allies in order to withstand the challenges that are posed not only by Russia, but also other actors that are not necessarily aligned with our values. And this is one of the areas, for example, where the European Union has developed extremely useful tools. And it is not by chance that resilience is also mentioned in the third joint declaration as one of the areas in which we commit ourselves to work together much, much more. As I mentioned, this includes, for example, the protection of critical infrastructure. We've seen the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. This is one of the elements that also Secretary General Stoltenberg and President von der Leyen have discussed repeatedly. they have also announced the creation of a dedicated task force on resilient critical infrastructure, which will be part of the existing structural dialogue on resilience that we have at staff level. So I think it's really important to stress this 360 degrees approach. And when it comes to the political interaction that I mentioned, this is absolutely crucial. Looking at the two staffs, the two organizations, for example, from a Commission perspective, we have very regular briefings by members of the College of Commissioners to the North Atlantic Council that cover obviously all areas that are within the EU remit that could be of interest to NATO. I think the president has always been extremely clear in saying that the members of the Commission are always happy and ready to brief NATO on EU initiatives, be it defense initiatives, but also much more in this 360-degree approach that I mentioned. Most recently, Commissioner Breton briefed the North Atlantic Council on several EU initiatives in his portfolio, obviously related mostly in this case to defense, military mobility, on possible new joint procurement initiatives, which is obviously very high on the agenda, considering indeed the situation in light also of the support that allies and member states are providing to Ukraine when it comes to military capabilities, but also ammunitions and many more. And obviously one level lower, so at expert level, we have very, very regular cross briefings, as we call them in our jargon. So having respective staffs brief allies and member states in a broad range of areas. Cooperation on Ukraine obviously is very high on the agenda. Our colleagues from the Commission, together with colleagues in the European External Action Service, have briefed NATO regularly, in particular on the support that we are providing to Ukraine, which, as you know, is quite substantial, covering not only microfinancial assistance, but also humanitarian assistance, energy security, military assistance through the European Peace Facility, and many more. And why it is important to have this type of interaction, this regular interaction, this cross briefings, this constant exchanges, because it really allows, first of all, to have this shared situational awareness and joint picture of what both organizations are doing, what our collective added value is. And it's also very useful to ensure, that the principles that I mentioned earlier on are respected, especially openness and transparency. We are very keen to make sure that member states and allies are perfectly comfortable when it comes to all areas of cooperation.
I'm going to take it a little bit back to something I mentioned in the introduction, and we've spoke about in roundabout terms, I guess, which is with the invasion of Russia and Ukraine, there's been some significant consequences for Europe, especially in terms of NATO and EU-NATO, especially, and I'm thinking more specifically in terms of the accession requests of Finland and Sweden. Now, of course, these are huge. This was a monumental shift in their policy to apply for NATO membership after years of trying to remain neutral, if that makes sense. But of course, Finland and Sweden are key EU member states as well. So I guess my question for you is, how would you see the applications of Finland and Sweden to NATO? Are they good for the European Union? With this, as we've heard, 96% of citizens of the European Union will be a NATO member. So is this something you would be encouraging other EU member states to seek NATO membership as well, or not?
The accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, as you said, it's a monumental shift and an extremely important element when it comes to EU-NATO cooperation. In my perspective, and obviously I speak in my personal capacity, it's extremely important, and it's very welcome. I think also from the perspective of shared membership, going from 21 to 23 shared members is definitely a positive element that will contribute to further promote EU-NATO cooperation. Finland and Sweden have always been strong supporters of stronger interactions between the EU and NATO, and in my view have great experience that will benefit the alliance, especially when it comes to resilience. They are very accustomed to the concept of total defense, societal resilience in particular, and I know that NATO allies and NATO are very keen to tap into that expertise that will be for the benefit of all.
On the 18th of May 2022, following the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February of that year, EU member states Finland and Sweden handed in their official letters of application to join NATO. By the 5th of July, accession protocols were signed for both countries after the completion of accession talks. There is, however, a final step for their accession, that being ratification by all NATO allies in accordance with their national procedures. And this step has been delayed until the time of this recording. A key difficulty has been NATO ally Turkey's objection to Sweden, based upon domestic policy issues, including the demand to deport alleged terrorists. And while there continues to be this impasse, new unconfirmed reports have emerged that suggest that rather than continuing the bid as a joint venture between the two Northern European neighbours, the bid will separate to allow Finland the opportunity to accede quicker. NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg on the 14th of February 2023 in Brussels was quoted as saying, "The main thing is that both would be accepted as full members as soon as possible." This has led some commentators to speculate that Finland will indeed accede to NATO faster than Sweden. Now I'll follow up with a slightly different question, because obviously being here in Brussels and in European circles, there's a lot of talk about this concept of strategic autonomy, that many people advocate for the European Union to be seeking strategic autonomy. And by strategic autonomy, I mean this idea that the EU is, or at least should be, developing the means and resources to pursue its own foreign policy interests outside of the influence of third countries. And organizations, for that matter, including NATO. For some people see a distinction between the two on this. So would you say that the EU is doing this currently? And in your opinion, does the significant overlap between the EU and NATO on so many issues of defense help or hinder this objective of strategic autonomy?
Strategic autonomy has been a little bit one of the many buzzwords around Brussels, obviously. But what does it mean exactly? I think we have some very concrete and good examples on this. In my view, it is really about a more sovereign union, adopting this 360-degree approach that I mentioned earlier. And we've seen from many member states strong calls for a more sovereign union. We've seen that during COVID-19. The unprecedented scale of the EU response and EU support to member states, also when it comes to vaccine procurement, obviously extremely important developments also in that perspective. But a more sovereign union also concerns, for example, trade and being able to defend our trade interests better than we have done so far. It is about technological sovereignty, and emerging and disruptive technologies are an extremely important element that is very high on the agenda at the moment. And this is true not only for the EU, but also for NATO when it comes to maintaining the technological edge of the West. A more sovereign union is also about energy. And we've seen, especially in the past year, how important and how incredible it has been in terms of efforts on reducing energy dependency from Russia. It is about raw materials, connected again to technologies that I mentioned. And obviously, defense is part of this 360-degree approach to a more sovereign union. When it comes to defense, I think there is a very important quote that is always mentioned in this case, comes from the Strategic Compass, which is the guiding document for EU security and defense, which refers specifically to the importance for the Union to be able to act decisively with partners if possible and alone when necessary. And this is really the key guiding principle when it comes to strategic autonomy for defense. And I think in this context, as I mentioned, there is a very good understanding when it comes to the EU-NATO relationship and the EU-NATO partnership of the fact that the EU has indeed tools that are important to be reinforced that can benefit the whole transatlantic democratic area. Just to mention an additional one, obviously sanctions against Russia in this specific case. We've seen how decisively the Union has been able to act, very closely coordinated with the partners in the G7.
Let's return to this third joint declaration that was signed last month. So the 13th stanza of the declaration states the following: We encourage the fullest possible involvement of the NATO allies that are not members of the EU in its initiatives. We encourage the fullest possible involvement of the EU members that are not part of the alliance in its initiatives. Now, I bring up this quote because we have seen some difficulties between non-EU NATO members and EU member states playing out in a way that has ramifications for defence policy. How do you perceive these difficulties in the EU-NATO partnership? And further, and perhaps more importantly, are these difficulties resolvable?
This has always been one of the key questions on EU-NATO cooperation, and it really comes down to the different membership of the organization. So that's why increasing the common members can have a positive impact on this dynamics. We are all very well aware of the sensitivities on both sides when it comes to member states and allies. There are certainly some bilateral irritants, but the most important thing is that these irritants do not affect the cooperation between the two organizations when it comes to staff interactions. That's why in my introduction I stressed how important it is to have indeed this very light structure for staff interactions, because this allows us to concretely move forward, and also to have the flexibility to navigate around some of the stumbling blocks that are there, and obviously are beyond the control of the institutions as such, but are fully in the hands of member states and allies, whose full support for EU-NATO cooperation continues to remain essential. Going back to your quote from the third joint declaration, the involvement of non-EU allies in EU defense initiatives is obviously one of the very important elements that are part of the EU cooperation. We have, I think, very good examples when it comes to also Commission programs, for example, the European Defence Fund, and the fact that initially there was maybe some skepticism or some misperception also on whether this would create additional restrictions in terms of participations of non-EU allies to EU defense initiatives. Now that we are a few years into the implementation, also following the EDIDP test case, it's very clear that these initiatives are indeed open to EU allies. There are non-EU controlled entities. There is a very clear regulation. I will not bore who is listening to the podcast on the details, but I think the key message here is that the EU defense initiatives are open to non-EU allies, and as a matter of fact, there are indeed both non-EU controlled entities, but also allies directly that participate in defense initiatives. Another example, obviously, is military mobility, where now in the permanent structured cooperation project led by the Netherlands, this is obviously a member state-led initiative, but some important key non-EU allies are part of the PESCO project. And military mobility is really the flagship of EU-NATO cooperation. It's one of the areas where we have made incredible progress. There is still a lot to do. The Commission has presented a new action plan in November last year. So definitely a space to watch going forward.
Now, it's interesting that you brought up PESCO in this context, because that raises another question that I have, which is often the EU is criticized for making a lot of promises and then delivering in either a slower or less efficient way on certain things. Now, this covers all sorts of different sectors of EU policy, but especially on PESCO, one of the criticisms that I read in the evaluation of PESCO is that the promises by signatories to that treaty on structured cooperation weren't being delivered in terms of exercises and practical initiatives. Now, my question to you is, does the EU need to do more to make these defense initiatives work better? Does it need to do more to get more actual practical military exercises happening in the continent? And is this something that has been requested by NATO partners, for example?
This is one of the areas that is being discussed, I think, right now, especially with the adoption of the strategic compass. And here I'm really speaking as someone who's extremely fond of security and defense, especially EU security and defense, and not in relation to what I actually do in my work. But obviously, the strategic compass has raised the bar when it comes to the ambition of the Union on security and defense in all domains. You mentioned exercises, and indeed, There is the commitment to also carry out live exercises for the very first time. And this is an extremely crucial development. I will mention the fact that this obviously contributes a lot to the resilience of the European Union and of our armed forces. I always go back to resilience because it really is the absolute foundation and common thread, I think, across all the policy area in this moment. It is obviously for member states themselves to commit forces, to commit to common security and defense policy missions and operations. There are some very good indications in that perspective. Obviously, it's a long-term project. The Compass itself looks at 2030. There are very clear timeline there, but it's a long-term project. I think looking from a Commission perspective, this is one of the considerations, obviously, that relates also to EU-NATO cooperation, because we always say that EU-NATO cooperation is a key pillar of EU defense initiatives. It's extremely important to strengthen the EU, to strengthen also EU capacities and capabilities on defense, because we are strongly convinced that a stronger EU also benefits NATO and it makes NATO stronger. So it's two tracks that proceed in parallel. They are both long-term, obviously, but they are mutually reinforcing. And we're seeing, as I mentioned, the results already now. And I think just to plug in a little bit of a spot as well for those that are interested in looking exactly at some of the areas of cooperation, some of the concrete results of EU-NATO cooperation in all areas, as I mentioned, capabilities, hybrid threats, cyber, disinformation, etc., is the annual reports that we negotiate among the staffs and then are presented to the respective councils by the High Representative and NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. It's a very useful, I think, document to have a good overview of the concrete results of our cooperation. I can say also quite some painful negotiations on that, but definitely a good overview.
Great. So let's move to my final discussion points here. And you mentioned this a little bit in terms of the strategic compass and this plan towards 2030. But looking forward to the future, how do you expect the EU-NATO partnership to develop further, especially with this context of what Russia's doing at the moment? Do we see greater, resource sharing or strategic integration? Do we see these being more plausible on the horizon? And further to that, I think as a general remark, for European citizens in general, should they take confidence in their security, in their, as you've mentioned a few times, in the ability of both the EU, their own members, their own national governments, and NATO to ensure they have a resilient society moving forward? How can we take, especially in such a difficult time, how can they take confidence in that?
Looking ahead, there is clearly a lot of work. There is a lot that can be done. I will not speculate on how the geopolitical context can evolve, but obviously it's very clear that we have a strong and persistent threat that is not going to go away in the next years. So we will have definitely to rethink probably our approach to certain elements. We have obviously Russia, that is the most direct threat to the Euro-Atlantic area, but it's not the only one. Mentioning again the importance of having resilient societies, for example, against disinformation. There are many actors that are investing a lot in spreading disinformation, conspiracy theories, false narratives that really affect our societies and try to undermine also the trust in our own democracies. And this is one of the areas on which we will need to be extremely vigilant going forward. And I think every citizen has the responsibility to contribute to this effort, try to be better informed, trying to vet also the resources from which they get information. And I think also EU institutions are really investing a lot of efforts in this direction. It is recognized as one of the areas on which there is indeed much more that can be done. Clear potential to further deepen EU-NATO cooperation in this domain. It is also mentioned in the joint declaration. Again, resilience, obviously, I mentioned it, I think, countless times, so I will not further refer to that. But obviously, I think there is a clear shift when it comes to protection of our Euro-Atlantic space. NATO going back to a more hardcore, let's say, deterrence and defense in that sense. And obviously, I think for citizens, something that is obviously very important is to witness also this shift towards, I think, a necessary, stronger investment by national governments in increasing defense spending, military capabilities. Speaking again, my personal views. Obviously, ideally one could think of many other domains in which could increase spending. Unfortunately, we are facing a very present and clear threat, and I assume that governments will not have much leeway going forward. So I think for the coming years, indeed, quite a clear focus on some of the challenges that we have, but also with a very clear idea of how to go forward, how to address them. And I think EU-NATO cooperation is an absolutely fundamental piece of this puzzle. Again, 360-degree approach. As I mentioned, there are many, many areas. Military threats are not the only threats that we are facing. Also, when it comes to climate change and climate and security and the implications of climate change on security and defense are another important areas that will definitely be high on the agenda in the coming years. Another element on which EU-NATO cooperation will increase. And another element that I cannot avoid mentioning is obviously space and emerging disruptive technologies. Again, long-term perspectives, but we need to work on these elements now. We need to be ready when it comes 2030, 2040, 2050.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. I think it's heartening to hear that there are so many plans in place for the long term on all these different issues. As you say, Russia's not the only problem that the EU is facing right now, and is not only the only problem on defense either. As you said, cyber threats, hybrid threats are incredibly disruptive, and there needs to be strong and targeted strategies that's integrated with relevant agencies, both EU and NATO here. So it's good to hear that there are these things in place to tackle these shared challenges. With that, I'm going to wrap up the podcast episode today. Again, thank you for joining me, Alessandro. And for all our listeners, please join another episode of the MENA Talks podcast very soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.